Title: The Echoes of Pursuit. Chapter 1. The Invitation. Ava woke up to the sound of rain tapping against her window. It was the kind of rain that never seemed to stop, soft yet persistent, a relentless murmur that blended with the rustling of the wind in the trees. She had been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, but now the rain seemed to be urging her to rise. She glanced at the clock. 7:03 a.m. A typical morning. Yet this morning was different. There was an envelope waiting for her on the kitchen table. The paper was thick and textured, almost like old parchment, its edges slightly frayed as though it had traveled a great distance to reach her. Her name was written on the front in elegant flowing script, the ink dark and precise. It wasn't her handwriting. In fact, it wasn't anyone she knew. The way the letters curved and looped made her feel as though they were meant for her eyes only, a private message from the shadows. Ava hesitated before opening it. There was something unsettling about the envelope, something too polished, too deliberate. She ran her fingers across the smooth surface of the paper, as if trying to divine its contents by touch alone. With a faint shiver, she slid her finger under the flap and opened it. The first thing she noticed was the scent, a mixture of damp earth and something floral, vaguely sweet but not pleasant. It clung to her senses like a memory she couldn't place, a feeling that was familiar yet distant, as if it had been calling to her from deep within the recesses of her mind. She unfolded the letter carefully, her eyes scanning the elegant, almost hypnotic handwriting. Dear Dr. Ava Sterling, we are pleased to extend to you an invitation to participate in a groundbreaking psychological study conducted at the Pursuit Institute. Our facility, nestled in the heart of a secluded forest, is renowned for its avant-garde research into the human mind. You, with your exceptional credentials and pioneering work in cognitive psychology, have been selected as a prime candidate for the next phase of our research. The Pursuit Institute offers an environment unlike any other, a place where the boundaries of consciousness and perception are tested, expanded, and sometimes unraveled. This is a unique opportunity to advance your career and contribute to the future of human understanding. We trust you will consider this invitation carefully and join us in our quest for discovery. Your participation is voluntary, but your contribution is invaluable. Please find enclosed details regarding your arrival and the commencement of the program. We look forward to your acceptance. Sincerely, the Director, Pursuit Institute. Ava felt a coldness seep into her bones as she reread the letter. The language was unnervingly formal, yet there was an underlying warmth that seemed to pulse beneath the surface, like a hidden message meant to draw her in. The words unraveled and boundaries of consciousness seemed to linger in her mind, repeating like a quiet whisper, as if they were meant to mean something more than they appeared. Her mind raced. The Pursuit Institute. She had never heard of it, and yet the name felt oddly familiar, as though she had known it for a long time, even if only in dreams. The letter spoke of cognitive psychology, of human understanding, but there was something about the phrasing, the tone, that unsettled her. Something was not quite right. Ava had worked her entire life to get to this point. She had made a name for herself in the field of psychological research, publishing articles that pushed the boundaries of what was known about the human brain. But this felt different. She wasn't just being invited to a research project. She was being summoned. The invitation had come out of nowhere. No prior correspondence, no interview, no indication that she had even been considered for such a prestigious program. It was as if the invitation had found her, as if the Institute had known exactly where to find her, knew exactly what she needed. Her fingers trembled as she set the letter down. She felt the weight of it, heavy with possibility. And yet, a flicker of doubt burned in her chest. Why had they chosen her? What was the true nature of this research? She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breath. The rain outside had picked up, now pounding the roof in a furious rhythm. The world felt distant, disconnected, as though her mind had begun to drift somewhere far away, as though the invitation had already started to pull her towards something darker, deeper. Later that night, Ava sat at her desk, the letter open before her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something just beyond the edge of her vision, lurking in the shadows. Every sound in her apartment seemed amplified. Creaks of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional rattle of the window pane against the wind. The world outside felt distant, separated by some unseen barrier, and inside, she was trapped within the letter's grip, unable to escape. She stood and paced the room, trying to clear her thoughts. Her reflection in the window was distorted by the rain running down the glass. For a moment, she saw not her own face, but something other. Something unfamiliar, dark and shadowed, like a part of herself that had been waiting, dormant, ready to emerge. It was then that the phone rang. The sound sliced through the quiet of the apartment like a blade. Ava jumped, startled, and looked at the caller ID. It was an unknown number, no area code she recognized. A chill ran down her spine, but her hand reached out, almost involuntarily, to answer. "Hello," she said, her voice unsteady. "Dr. Sterling," came a smooth voice from the other end. "This is Dr. Miller, the director of the Pursuit Institute. I trust you received our invitation." Ava's heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. The voice on the phone was calm, measured, but there was something in it that made her skin crawl. It was as if the man were somehow inside her head, already aware of her every thought, every hesitation. Yes, I received it," Ava replied, her voice trembling. "But I'm not sure I understand. Why me? Why have you chosen me for this study?" Dr. Miller's voice took on a tone of understanding, as if her doubts were nothing more than a passing concern. "You've been selected because you are ready, Dr. Sterling. You've spent your life studying the mind. Now we invite you to experience it firsthand. What you'll learn here cannot be found in any textbook. What you'll see, feel, and understand, it will change you forever." Ava opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She felt as though she were teetering on the edge of a precipice, staring into a void that stretched out infinitely before her. "We look forward to your arrival," Dr. Miller continued, his voice now smooth, coaxing. "The Institute is waiting for you." Before Ava could say another word, the line went dead. The phone call left her reeling, her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. She stared at the empty space where the phone had once been, the quiet now pressing down on her like a heavy weight. The rain outside had intensified, but it was as if she could no longer hear it. All that remained was the echo of Dr. Miller's words, repeating in her mind, "The Institute is waiting for you." Ava's gaze flickered to the envelope once more. The invitation had already begun to work its spell, weaving its dark threads around her, drawing her in. She knew deep down that she had no choice but to go. The Institute had already claimed her. She was already theirs. And in that moment, the rain, the night, and the world outside felt irrelevant. She was already being pulled into something far greater than she could comprehend. There was no turning back. End of chapter 1. This expanded version introduces Ava's internal conflict, her increasing unease with the invitation, and the subtle manipulations that begin even before she arrives at the Institute. The tone remains unsettling, building an atmosphere of dread that will continue throughout the story. Chapter 2. The Arrival. The journey to the Pursuit Institute felt long, even though it had only taken a few hours. Ava's eyes had glazed over as the countryside stretched endlessly before her, the dense forest swallowing the road ahead. The landscape outside her window was a blur of dark trees and thick, ever-encroaching fog. It was the kind of fog that made you feel as though the world beyond it was not only hidden, but unreachable. Like an illusion, a memory fading just beyond the horizon. Ava had spent the entire drive in silence, the hum of the car's engine the only sound accompanying her thoughts. Her mind was a mess, a chaotic swirl of questions and uncertainty. The invitation had been unnerving enough, but this, the road itself, the path that led to the Institute, seemed to have no end. The trees around her grew thicker as they neared the Institute, their trunks blackened by age, their branches twisted in unnatural shapes as though they were trying to claw their way toward the sky. The air smelled different here, heavier, suffused with the scent of damp earth, decay, and something sweetly sickening that she couldn't quite place. Finally, After what seemed like an eternity, the car crested a hill. The trees parted, revealing the institute ahead. Ava's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a building, it was a monument, a grand, dark structure that loomed out of the fog like some ancient cathedral, but with an unmistakable sense of malevolence. It seemed both timeless and out of place, a contradiction in itself. The stone walls were dark and weathered, as though they had stood there for centuries, untouched by time. The towering spires rose high above her, their sharp edges cutting into the sky, making the entire building look like a fortress, designed not to house knowledge, but to trap it. The car slowed to a stop, and Ava felt a tightness in her chest, a creeping discomfort that was impossible to ignore. Her pulse quickened as she took in the sight of the grand entrance, its massive oak doors standing open, waiting to swallow her whole. "Here we are," the driver said, his voice barely a whisper as though the place itself demanded silence. Ava nodded numbly, her mouth dry as she stepped out of the car. The cold air hit her immediately, sharp and biting. The fog clung to her skin, and the distant sound of wind through the trees seemed to carry with it something darker, something lost. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing, dressed in a long, dark coat that seemed to blend seamlessly with the surroundings. Dr. Miller. His eyes were calm, dispassionate, but there was a glint to them that made her stomach churn. His smile was polite but hollow, as though it was rehearsed for a role he had played 1,000 times. Ava couldn't shake the feeling that he was studying her, measuring her every reaction, weighing her presence in a way that was far too deliberate. "Dr. Sterling, welcome," he said in his soft, melodious voice, a tone that held an unnerving sense of control. "We're pleased to have you here." "Thank you for having me," Ava replied, her voice shaky, though she wasn't sure why. "You must be tired after your journey. Allow me to show you to your quarters." Ava wanted to protest. She wasn't tired, not yet. But the way he said it, the way his eyes glimmered as though he already knew what was best for her, made her hesitate. She simply nodded, following him into the shadow of the building. The interior of the institute was no less imposing. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, polished to a glossy sheen that reflected the dim light from the chandeliers hanging above. The air smelled faintly of incense and something more metallic, like old iron. Ava's footsteps echoed in the vastness of the entrance hall, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the heavy silence that pervaded the entire building. Dr. Miller led her down a long hallway, its walls adorned with strange, abstract paintings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as though they were watching her with eyes that followed her every move. Some of the paintings were grotesque, their colors clashing in ways that unsettled her, while others were eerily calm, with serene landscapes and portraits of individuals whose faces seemed almost too perfect, too frozen in time. Ava couldn't help but glance at each one as she passed, her unease growing with every step. She could almost hear whispers, faint and distant, as if the paintings were talking to her, or to each other. She quickly turned her attention forward, focusing on Dr. Miller's back as he walked ahead, his stride purposeful and confident. He stopped at a large wooden door at the end of the hallway and turned to face her. "Your quarters. I hope you'll find them comfortable. The Institute prides itself on providing a conducive environment for our participants." Ava didn't respond immediately. She could sense something was wrong, but the weight of the place, its oppressive atmosphere, was making it difficult to think clearly. She forced herself to take a deep breath, then nodded and stepped into the room. The room was vast, larger than she expected, furnished with a large bed, a desk, a few chairs, and tall windows that looked out onto the foggy landscape beyond. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but the books on them weren't titles she recognized. They looked ancient, their bindings worn and frayed, like they had been untouched for decades, if not centuries. Ava walked toward the window and peered outside, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. For a moment, she felt disconnected from herself, as though the person in the reflection was a stranger, someone she had never met. She shook her head, trying to clear the strange sensation, but it lingered in the pit of her stomach. She turned away from the window and sat down on the bed, the mattress firm and unyielding beneath her. She looked around the room again, noticing the small details that made it feel off. The subtle symmetry of the furniture, the curtains that seemed too heavy for the room, the clock on the wall that ticked louder than it should, its rhythm slow, deliberate, almost mocking. There was something else too, something she couldn't place, a feeling, a presence. It was as if the room itself was alive, breathing with her, watching her. The longer she sat in silence, the more she felt it. A low hum, just beneath her hearing, vibrating through the floor and walls. The air was thick, saturated with an energy she couldn't define. It made her skin prickle. She snapped out of her reverie when she heard a soft knock at the door. Her heart jumped, and she stood too quickly, feeling dizzy for a moment. She walked over and opened it to find Dr. Miller standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable. "I trust you're settling in," he said, his voice almost too smooth, too measured. Yes, Ava replied, her mouth dry. "It's just a bit overwhelming." He smiled, the same polite, distant smile. "You'll grow accustomed to it. The Institute has a way of integrating its participants. The process is always a little disorienting at first, but in time, you'll see things as they truly are." Ava didn't respond, unsure of how to reply to that. She looked down the hallway, trying to discern the source of the unsettling hum she'd been feeling. But there was nothing. Only the long, empty stretch of corridor, fading into the distance. "Dinner will be served shortly. I encourage you to join us," Dr. Miller said, before turning and walking away without another word. Ava stood at the door, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something far darker than she had anticipated. The air here was thick with secrets, and she felt like an intruder, like she wasn't meant to be a part of this place, that the shadows had been waiting for her, watching her from the moment she set foot inside. Later, she would learn that the Institute had its own rhythm, its own rules. It moved in ways that defied understanding, and every moment felt like it belonged to something larger, something beyond comprehension. But for now, all Ava could do was sit back and try to make sense of the pieces that were already beginning to fall into place. And deep down, she knew, no matter how hard she tried to escape it, the truth was already here, lurking in the silence, watching her every move. End of chapter 2. This chapter builds on the introduction to the Institute, maintaining the eerie, suffocating atmosphere while highlighting Ava's growing discomfort and confusion. The use of subtle psychological tension, strange sensations, and unexplained details continues to deepen the sense of foreboding. Chapter 3. The Unseen Hand. The night stretched endlessly before her, a blanket of blackness that seemed to press down on the entire Institute. Ava couldn't sleep. Her eyes darted around the room, restless, each corner shadowed by something she couldn't quite identify. The bed, though comfortable in appearance, felt foreign beneath her, like an elaborate trap waiting to ensnare her in some invisible snare. It was a strange disquiet that filled her, something deeper than fear, something ancient and gnawing, as though the very building around her was alive with dark intent. She had always prided herself on her ability to remain calm under pressure, but tonight, that strength seemed to wither. Her chest felt tight, as though the walls themselves were closing in around her, inch by slow inch. The tick of the old-fashioned clock on the wall became more pronounced, each click slicing through the silence like a slow-moving blade. She tried to distract herself, counting sheep, reading through the syllabus again, mentally revising her course materials for the next day. But no matter how hard she tried, the sensation of being watched lingered. It was subtle, but undeniable, a weight pressing on her chest, tightening the air around her, making every breath a labor. The faintest of sounds caught her attention, a scraping, like nails dragging against a chalkboard, coming from somewhere in the room. She froze, her heart pounding, the hairs on the back of her neck rising. It wasn't the kind of sound she could ignore. It wasn't the hum of the building settling or the rustle of the trees outside in the wind. No, this sound was deliberate. Ava slowly sat up, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. The flickering light from the desk lamp cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to shift with every blink of her eyes. She was beginning to feel like she was losing her grip on reality. Had she imagined it? Was the building playing tricks on her? Or was it something else? The sound grew louder. It came again. Closer this time. And unmistakable. Something was scraping against the wall. Something. Or someone. Her pulse quickened, and for a split second, her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, to get out of this suffocating room. The clock on the wall chimed loudly, 2 a.m., its toll reverberating throughout the room like the clang of an iron bell. A harsh reminder that time was slipping away. Ava didn't know what she was waiting for, but whatever it was, she had a growing sense that it was about to reveal itself. Ava stood, her legs unsteady beneath her as if the very air had thickened, making movement more difficult. She padded across the floor, her bare feet silent against the cold stone, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door, slowly turning the knob. But before she opened it, she paused. The scraping sound had stopped. In the unnatural silence that followed, her thoughts spiraled. Could it be that the Institute was trying to tell her something? Or was this just the beginning of her unraveling? She shook her head. No, she wasn't going to let fear control her. Not again. She opened the door, and the cold draft hit her immediately, as though the building was breathing in tandem with her own frantic pulse. The hallway outside her room was dimly lit by a series of flickering, dull lights. The walls, once pristine and immaculate, were now marred by dark stains, some of them too intricate to be natural, almost like patterns, like symbols that shifted when she wasn't looking directly at them. The silence in the hall was almost unbearable, thick with something oppressive, but she felt an urge to walk, to get away from the suffocating air of her room, to find some form of release. She didn't know where she was going, but something in the pit of her stomach urged her forward. Something was calling to her. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hall, the sound unnaturally loud, amplified by the stillness around her. The familiar sensation of being watched returned, stronger now. It wasn't just a presence anymore. It was as if someone, was following her every movement, waiting for her to slip, to falter. Ava reached the end of the hallway and stopped. She stared at the staircase ahead, the steps leading down into the lower floors of the Institute, which she hadn't yet explored. She remembered the brief tour they had given her on her first day. Her guide had quickly ushered her through this part, barely giving her a chance to glance at the dimly lit corridors that twisted like a maze beneath her feet. But now, standing there, something drew her toward them. The stairs creaked under her weight as she descended, one step at a time, the sound reminding her of old bones breaking, the slow grind of something that had long since been forgotten. The deeper she went, the colder it became, until she felt as though she was descending into some forgotten pit. The air grew damp, thick with the smell of mildew, and something far more rancid, something decayed, almost putrid. She didn't know how long she'd been walking when she finally reached the bottom of the stairs. The hallway stretched before her, its walls lined with dust-covered shelves that held books she could barely make out in the dim light. But it wasn't the books that caught her attention. It was the door at the end of the hall. It was ajar, a faint light spilling from the gap. For a moment, she hesitated. The instinct to turn around, to return to her room and forget she had ever wandered this far, was almost overwhelming. But curiosity, something she hadn't felt in years, a nagging pull deep in her gut, compelled her forward. She walked toward the door, each step heavy, deliberate. As she reached for the handle, her fingers brushed the cold metal. It was so cold it felt like ice. She pushed it open. Inside, the room appeared ordinary at first. An old library. The shelves, however, were filled with books she did not recognize. They were worn, their covers frayed, their pages yellowed with age. The scent of mildew and old paper mixed with something more sinister, something she could not place. Her eyes darted around the room. It was cavernous, its walls stretching far beyond what she could see. The dim lighting only added to the oppressive atmosphere, as if the room itself were holding its breath. At the center of the room sat a desk, its surface cluttered with books, papers, and what looked like old ink stains. But it wasn't the desk that drew her attention. It was the book on top of it. The book was open, its pages filled with strange, twisted symbols that seemed to shimmer in the low light. Ava's throat tightened as she stepped closer, her fingers itching to touch it, even though some deep part of her warned her not to. The symbols on the page were foreign, unrecognizable. They seemed to pulse as if alive, shifting and contorting before her eyes. They were hypnotic, pulling her in, like the black depths of an ocean threatening to drown her. As she reached out, the air around her grew heavy, thick, as though the room was pressing in from all sides. A coldness settled over her skin, crawling beneath her flesh, a sensation of something alive, watching, waiting. Just then, she heard it. A sound, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It came from behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A shadow moved in the doorway, tall and imposing, draped in darkness. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. The figure was too tall, too still, too unnatural. It was more like a presence, something that didn't belong here, something that had no place in this world. Ava gasped, stepping back, her mind reeling. Her legs gave way, and she fell to her knees, unable to look away from the figure standing at the door. Its shape blurred, as though it wasn't quite solid. The shadows seemed to crawl over its form, merging with the dark walls, making it impossible to discern its true shape. Who are you? Ava's voice trembled, barely a whisper, but it felt like it tore through the silence of the room, shattering the stillness. The figure didn't answer. It only stared at her, its presence suffocating her, its gaze pinning her in place. Ava's breath came in ragged gasps as she scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the cold stone floor, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. She couldn't look away from the abyss that seemed to stare back at her, the silent threat that hung in the air. It moved closer. "Ava!" a voice rasped. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The voice was distorted, stretched thin, as though it came from somewhere far beyond her reach. The figure raised a hand, and as it did, Ava felt a sharp, sudden pain in her chest, as if something were being torn from her. The sensation was unbearable. She gasped for breath, but it felt like her lungs had stopped working, as if the very air had turned to stone. The figure's hand hovered inches from her face, and then, in a moment of horrible clarity, Ava realized what it was. It was drawing something from her. It was stealing something vital, something she couldn't afford to lose. With a burst of adrenaline, Ava pushed herself to her feet, her legs unsteady. She didn't know how she managed it, but she stumbled toward the door, her heart hammering in her chest. The shadow didn't chase her. It just stood there, watching, waiting. Ava didn't stop running. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The last thing she remembered was the cold, familiar light of her room as she slammed the door shut behind her, locking it with trembling hands. Chapter 4. Whispers in the dark. The morning sunlight slanted through the cracks in the heavy curtains, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. Ava awoke with a start, the unsettling, dreamlike images from the night still lingering in her mind. The memory of the shadowy figure, the cold, suffocating presence that had watched her, drawn something from her, was still raw, etched into her thoughts like a scar. She hadn't returned to her room until the early hours of the morning, and now, in the waking light, she felt exposed, fragile. She tried to shake off the dread that clung to her like a second skin, but it was impossible. The very walls of the institute felt alive, watching her every move. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. The screen lit up with a message from Dr. Hargrove. "Ava, I trust you're settling in. Meet me in the staff room at 10 a.m. There are some things we need to discuss." The message was brief, curt, but somehow still managed to send a shiver down her spine. Dr. Hargrove. He had seemed distant, even evasive, during their brief interactions. The words he had spoken to her, half-formed and cryptic, echoed in her mind. "The Institute holds more than just knowledge. Be careful where you tread." Ava shoved the covers off and sat up, the air in her room heavy with the lingering chill from the night before. She didn't know what Dr. Hargrove had meant by those words, but she was beginning to understand. The Institute, with its labyrinthine halls, its secrets lurking beneath the surface, there was something deeply wrong about it. something beyond the scope of academia. With a sigh, she pulled herself out of bed, glancing at the clock. 9:30 a.m. She didn't have much time before the meeting. As she dressed quickly in the plain uniform they had provided her, a crisp white blouse and dark pants, her eyes wandered to the window, the trees outside swaying gently in the wind. It looked so peaceful, so serene, but the beauty of it only added to the tension she felt in her chest. The calmness was an illusion, a mask hiding something far more sinister. The staff room was located on the second floor, near the back of the institute. Ava had passed it a few times but had never ventured inside. She had heard strange rumors from the other students, a place where faculty gathered to discuss matters beyond the students' understanding. There were whispers that not everything taught at the institute was strictly academic. When she arrived, Dr. Hargrove was already there, standing by the window, his back to her. He didn't turn when she entered, as though he had been waiting for her all along. "Good morning, Ava," he said, his voice like gravel sliding over glass. He didn't look at her but gestured toward the chair opposite his. "Please, sit." Ava obeyed, her heart beating a little faster in her chest. There was something about Dr. Hargrove, his cold, detached demeanor, his sharp features that never seemed to fully relax, that unsettled her more with each passing day. He finally turned to face her, his eyes unreadable. "I trust you're finding your time here enlightening." He paused, watching her closely. "I hope you aren't letting the atmosphere get to you." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. Ava wanted to ask him what he knew, how much he understood about what was happening in the institute, but she held her tongue. There was a reason he was a senior faculty member here. Whatever he knew, whatever he was trying to protect, he would do it on his terms. "I'm adjusting," she said carefully. "But I need to know more about what this place is." Dr. Hargrove's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained neutral. "You're a smart woman, Ava. You understand that this place has layers. Layers of history, of knowledge, of darkness." His voice dropped as he spoke the last word, the air in the room seeming to grow heavier, denser. Ava swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I saw something last night, downstairs in the lower levels. Something unnatural." She hesitated before adding, "A figure, a shadow, it—" "I know," Dr. Hargrove interrupted her, his voice low and urgent. "You shouldn't have gone down there. Not alone, not yet." He paced to the window, staring out, his back to her again. "There are things in the institute you are not ready for, Ava. Things you cannot comprehend." Ava's frustration flared. "Then why am I here? Why did you bring me to this place if I'm not supposed to understand?" "You misunderstand," he said, turning back to face her. His eyes seemed to darken, as though something ancient and bitter was stirring behind them. "You were brought here because you can understand, but only if you are willing to accept what you will uncover." The room felt colder suddenly, the shadows lengthening across the floor. Ava shivered involuntarily, her fingers tightening around the arms of the chair. Something in his tone made her blood run cold. He was telling her something she wasn't ready to hear. "You have to understand, Ava," he continued, his voice softer now, but carrying a heavy weight. "The institute is not just a place of learning. It is a vessel, an entity, a part of something far larger than you can imagine. It draws those like you, those who have a connection to the unknown. The paranormal. It doesn't want you here. It needs you." Ava's mind reeled, her thoughts stumbling over one another. "What are you talking about? What does the institute need from me?" Dr. Hargrove stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "It needs your mind, your will, your essence. It feeds on your curiosity. It lures you deeper into its grasp with each question you ask, with each door you open. You think this is about knowledge? No, it's about control." Ava stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're telling me this place is what? Alive? A living thing?" The disbelief in her voice was palpable, but as the words left her mouth, she began to wonder if it could be true. After everything she had already witnessed, everything that had been whispered in the dark corners of the institute, It was starting to make sense. "You will see," Dr. Hargrove said cryptically. "Soon enough, you will see. But you must be careful, Ava. You must not let it consume you." Before she could ask more, before she could demand answers, the door to the staff room slammed open with a force that rattled the walls. A gust of wind rushed in, the cold so biting it seemed to freeze the very air in the room. Ava spun around, her heart skipping a beat as the temperature dropped. The door stood wide open, but there was no sign of who or what had entered. The air was thick, suffocating, and filled with a low, unintelligible murmur, like whispers from 100 distant voices, rising in unison. "Do not let it call you," Dr. Hargrove warned, his voice trembling now, a crack breaking through his usual stoic demeanor. "Do not answer it." The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Ava's pulse quickened as the room seemed to close in around her. The shadows seemed to twist, to writhe against the walls, reaching out toward her, beckoning her into the dark, into the heart of the Institute's secrets. Ava stepped back, shaking her head in disbelief. "What is this place? What is happening?" But before Dr. Hargrove could respond, the whispers stopped. The door slammed shut as if on its own, the wind vanishing in an instant. The room fell silent, but the feeling of dread, of something unseen watching, waiting, remained, lingering like a suffocating fog. Dr. Hargrove straightened, his expression cold and composed once more. "You're not ready yet, but you will be. Soon." Ava's heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen in place. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, as the weight of the room pressed down on her. The whispers were gone, but the terror remained, a deep, unrelenting fear that she couldn't explain. As she turned to leave, her mind was a whirlwind of questions and dread. What had she just experienced? What had Dr. Hargrove been trying to warn her about? And what was it about the Institute that seemed to reach out, pulling her towards something far darker than she had ever imagined? Chapter 5. The Boundaries of the Mind. The sounds of the Institute were different that morning, unnaturally silent, as though the building itself were holding its breath. Ava moved through the corridors like a ghost, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath her, but the stillness was unnerving. The whispers from the previous night had not ceased. They echoed faintly in her ears, haunting her thoughts, urging her to listen, to understand. But understanding came at a price, and deep down, Ava feared that price was far more than she could pay. She had tried to shake it off. The things she had seen, the things she had felt, they didn't make sense. But the longer she stayed at the Institute, the clearer it became. There was no rational explanation. There were no scientific methods or logical frameworks that could capture what she was experiencing. The darkness in the halls seemed to stretch further with each passing day, each new whisper, each brush of air that made the hairs on her neck rise. Even the light, once warm and welcoming, now felt cold and distant. It cast harsh shadows on the walls, warping reality, bending it into something unrecognizable. Ava had already seen things in the Institute that defied the natural order, shadows that moved against the grain of light, reflections in mirrors that didn't belong to anyone in the room, doors that led to places they shouldn't. The strange anomaly she had stumbled upon, the hidden passageway beneath the Institute, was only the beginning. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that the Institute was not simply a building. It was a force, a living thing with an agenda, with a need that stretched back centuries. She had come to the conclusion that she could no longer trust the walls or the people inside them. Not even Dr. Hargrove, with his cryptic warnings and ambiguous words, could be fully trusted. His eyes, so sharp, had glimmered with something else when he spoke of the Institute's true purpose. Fear, regret, or something darker? The dreaded study. Ava's steps led her toward the lower floors of the Institute, toward the place that had haunted her thoughts since she first stumbled upon it. The study hall beneath the archives. She had heard rumors, whispers from the older students, of a place below the Institute where the forbidden was studied, where those who had come before her had pushed the boundaries of knowledge, only to lose themselves in the process. As she descended, the air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their contents old and brittle, with titles that appeared ancient, some in languages she didn't recognize. She had seen the study before, from a distance. It was hidden away, locked behind a heavy door, an iron-wrought barrier that no one seemed to know how to open. Until now. Ava's fingers brushed the door handle. It was warm to the touch, as though the door had been waiting for her to arrive. The moment she gripped it, the door creaked open, the sound like the groan of something awakening from a long slumber. Inside, the study was unlike anything she had expected. It wasn't just a room filled with books. It was a sanctum, a dark, sacred place where the boundaries between reality and the unknown were dangerously thin. The room was dimly lit by candles, their flames flickering, casting distorted shadows across the room. The scent of old parchment and incense hung heavily in the air, making her head spin. The bookshelves were filled with volumes so old they seemed to be crumbling at the edges, their covers etched with symbols she didn't recognize. The room was impossibly large, stretching further than the walls should have allowed, its dimensions bending in ways that were hard to comprehend. In the center of the room stood a table, cluttered with strange instruments, jars of unidentifiable liquids, scattered papers covered in arcane symbols, and old manuscripts bound in dark leather. On the table lay a large tome, its cover blackened and worn, its pages yellowed with age. Ava reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing against its surface, and she felt the familiar electric pulse of something ancient, something otherworldly. Before she could open the book, a voice stopped her. Low, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't be here." Ava froze, her hand still resting on the cover of the book. She spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. The voice, whispering, urgent, had come from nowhere. A chill crept down her spine. "You shouldn't be here." The words seemed to echo in her mind, reverberating through her consciousness. But who had spoken them? And why? Ava hesitated for only a moment before she lifted the cover of the book, her hands trembling. The pages were filled with incomprehensible text, written in a script that seemed to shift and change with every glance. The language was archaic, older than anything she had ever seen. But the words were familiar. They seemed to speak to her, beckoning her to read them. She leaned closer, her eyes scanning the text, and then, without warning, the words began to blur and shift. The letters twisted into jagged symbols, the ink darkening into red streaks. The air around her grew thick, suffocating, as if the room itself were alive, reacting to her intrusion. Ava slammed the book shut, her pulse pounding in her ears. She staggered backward, the room spinning around her. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, to coil in on themselves, their forms taking shape. Figures, indistinct and shifting, danced just beyond her sight, their shapes never fully coming into focus. The whispers started again, rising from the depths of the room. They were no longer words, just sounds, incoherent and maddening. The temperature dropped sharply, the chill of death creeping into her bones. Ava turned to leave, but the door had vanished. The walls had closed in around her, and the floor seemed to have shifted, warping beneath her feet. She was trapped in the study. The thought echoed in her mind, but it wasn't just a physical space. It was a state of being, a place where reality bent and broke, where the lines between the living and the dead, the known and the unknown, had been erased. And then she saw it. At the far end of the room, a figure stood in the darkness. It was tall, its form barely visible in the shadows. But as Ava's eyes adjusted to the dark, she saw it clearly. A tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a face twisted in an expression of agony. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The air in the room grew even colder as the figure stepped forward, its movement fluid and unnatural, as if it were both here and not here at the same time. Ava's breath caught in her throat. The figure was reaching toward her, its hands outstretched. "This is what the Institute wants," she realized with a sickening jolt. "This is what it needs." Before she could react, the figure's hand brushed against hers, and the room exploded into darkness. A transition to reality. Ava gasped, her eyes snapping open. The study was gone. The whispers had ceased. She was back in her room, sitting on the floor, trembling. Her hands were slick with sweat, her body rigid with fear. The book, the figure, had all been a dream, or had it? Her gaze flicked to the window. The world outside seemed unchanged, the sun casting its dull light over the grounds of the institute. But something inside her had shifted. She had touched something terrible, something that had left a mark on her. The whispers were gone now, but they lingered in her mind, calling to her. Beko. The silence in the institute grew heavier with each passing day, thick and suffocating. The corridors, once familiar in their sterile coldness, now seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. Ava had become hyper-aware of the subtle changes in the air, the faintest hum vibrating through the walls, the low creak of the floorboards as though the building itself was alive, breathing in tandem with her own anxious thoughts. That morning, she stood before the door to the study hall, which had become an obsession. The forbidden study beneath the Institute's archives had both terrified and drawn her in. The weight of what she'd discovered on her first visit, whispers, shadowed figures, and the crushing sense of a presence far older and more powerful than anything she had ever known, haunted her. Yet it wasn't enough to deter her. The knowledge, the pull of something vast and hidden within the walls was too strong. Ava had decided, in some quiet, dark corner of her mind, that she would face whatever it was that lay beyond this door. There would be no more turning back. She had already ventured too far. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the brass handle, a simple cold knob that now seemed to hold the fate of her sanity in its grip. The moment her fingers brushed it, the air around her seemed to ripple, as if the room were shifting in anticipation. The door creaked open slowly, as if it too was awakening from a long slumber. Inside, the room was far different than what she had expected. The study was vast, bigger than any room she had encountered in the Institute, its ceiling impossibly high, vanishing into the blackness above. The walls were lined with bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, their shelves crammed with books so old they looked as though they had been there since time began, their bindings thick with dust and age. Strange, almost indecipherable symbols adorned the spines, and the musty scent of old leather filled the air, mingling with something else, something faintly metallic, like the smell of blood. Candles, lit with a dim flickering flame, were scattered throughout the room, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls, moving in a way that was not natural. They made the room feel as if it were alive, breathing in the flickering light and exhaling the silence. There was an oppressive weight to the atmosphere, a feeling that it was too heavy to breathe in fully. The longer Ava stood there, the more she felt like she was sinking deeper into the room, like she was losing herself to its vastness. Her sense of time distorted, and she wondered just how long she had been standing there. Minutes, hours, days. At the center of the room was a large wooden table, worn and splintered by age. Scattered across its surface were various instruments, strange metallic tools, half-formed diagrams, yellowing parchment, and jars filled with substances Ava couldn't even begin to identify. The table was a mess, an altar to some unknown purpose, and yet everything was precisely arranged, organized chaos, as though the room itself had decided to display its secrets for her, to draw her in, only to pull away just as quickly. Ava's eyes flicked to the far corner of the room, where a large ancient book lay open on a pedestal. The pages were marked with symbols that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. She had to get closer. She felt an undeniable pull toward it, as if the book itself were calling to her, speaking in some forgotten language that only she could understand. Each step she took toward the book felt like stepping deeper into a dream. No, a nightmare. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift with each step, and the shadows stretched unnaturally, as if something were waiting just beyond the corner of her vision. Her fingers brushed the edge of the pedestal, cold and smooth against her skin. It was the final step, the last moment before everything would change. Before she could stop herself, she reached for the open pages, her hand trembling as she laid her fingers on the yellowed parchment. The words on the pages seemed to shift and change, almost as if the ink were alive. The script was indecipherable at first, but then it began to reveal itself to her, as though the very act of touching the book unlocked its secrets. She couldn't look away, the language wrapping itself around her mind, slipping under her skin like the cold. The words felt ancient, and yet they felt familiar. The boundaries of the mind are fragile. She read silently, her voice catching in her throat as the words formed into a chant, a prayer. The gates of knowledge are open only to those who seek beyond what is known. Once entered, there is no escape. The mind is a labyrinth. The path back is lost. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as the room seemed to shift again. The floor seemed to tilt, and the walls, once immovable, seemed to pulse like a living, breathing organism. Her head spun, her vision blurred. It was as if the book had reached inside her mind, pulling at something deep within her, something primal, something dark. You have entered the place of knowledge. A voice, low, rasping, barely a whisper, sounded in her ear. But it didn't come from any person in the room. It was a voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the very air around her. Her pulse quickened. She turned sharply, but there was no one there. She was alone. Or was she? The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, grow larger. Something was in the room with her. Something not entirely human. Something that had been waiting for her, drawn to her, feeding on her presence. Ava's mind reeled as a cold gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing several of the candles, leaving only a few flickering flames to cast long, twisted shadows across the floor. The floor beneath her feet suddenly seemed to give way, or perhaps her perception of it had fractured, splitting open like a door. She stumbled, barely catching herself, her hand clutching at the nearest shelf for support. But the shelf was not solid. It was as if it were made of smoke. Her fingers slipped through it, and a sickening lurch shot through her stomach. The walls began to close in on her, slowly, imperceptibly, as if the room itself were a trap, a cage that was squeezing the life out of her. She could feel the pressure in her chest, the constriction in her lungs. The shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, as if something was rising within them. Ava stumbled back, her breath quickening. Her heart raced in her chest. The whispers, that same low, unearthly murmur, filled her ears. It wasn't just a voice now. It was a chorus, dozens of voices overlapping, rising in intensity until they were deafening, drowning her thoughts in madness. The book, the chant, the shadows. You will never escape. Ava turned to run, but her legs felt like they were moving through molasses. Her body refused to obey. She reached for the door, but there was nothing there. Just an endless void. The room stretched infinitely, and with it, her fear grew. She was trapped, caught in the labyrinth of her own mind, and the Institute was a prison that had no escape. Her thoughts began to blur together, unable to distinguish between memory and hallucination. She couldn't remember what was real anymore. The voices were growing louder, louder than the beating of her own heart. They were pulling her down, pulling her apart. And then, as if on cue, the whispers stopped. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This was a deathly silence, heavy with the weight of something waiting, watching, just beyond her reach. Ava was no longer alone. The figure that had been lurking in the shadows was there, standing in front of her. A tall, gaunt silhouette, its face obscured in darkness, its presence suffocating and oppressive. It reached for her. The last thing she felt before everything went black was the cold touch of its hand on her shoulder. Chapter 8. The silence between the pages. Ava had thought that the horrors of the Institute had already clawed at the deepest, most vulnerable parts of her mind. But that was before she realized that it had only just begun. The deeper she dug, the closer she came to a truth that threatened to tear apart everything she had ever known. Every time she tried to close the door, to step back from the edge, someone would drag her back in. And now, as she stood at the threshold of the old lecture hall, the sense of something sinister hanging in the air was suffocating. A chill gripped her spine. The room was darker than it had ever been before. She could see nothing in the corners, just shadows that seemed to shift and stretch. The very walls felt like they were closing in on her, as if the building itself were holding its breath, waiting. It had been 3 days since she last ventured into the forbidden study beneath the archives. In that time, the Institute seemed to have transformed. The once clinical, sterile atmosphere had shifted, as though the very walls had absorbed the secrets she had uncovered. now exhaling them back out in a slow, suffocating haze. Ava had tried to resume her normal routine, meetings, classes, even small talk with colleagues. But everything felt off. The eyes that watched her when she walked down the hall seemed too intent, the murmurs in the background too purposeful, as if the entire place knew she had uncovered something that had been buried for a reason. The faces of the other staff had become increasingly unsettling. They no longer looked at her with simple curiosity. No, they seemed aware. She could feel their gaze tracking her as she walked. Their eyes were always slightly too narrow, their smiles stretched a little too tight. No one said anything, but the atmosphere weighed on her like 1,000 unspoken words, a collective knowing. And then there were the dreams. Dreams of books that whispered in the dead of night, books that were not written in any language she could understand, but somehow their meaning was clear. Every night she was drawn deeper into them, unable to escape the pages. There were whispers, of course, soft, persuasive voices that promised knowledge, that promised power. But they always came at a price. Ava had tried to shake off the nagging feeling that she was being followed, but each day, as the sun began to set, the feeling grew stronger. She could hear footsteps behind her, just at the edge of her hearing, too quiet to catch, yet too distinct to ignore. There was no one there when she turned, but she could feel it. Them, lurking, waiting. And so, she returned. With every step, her heart raced faster. Her footsteps echoed against the hollow walls, reverberating in the cavernous hallway. The air grew heavier, thick with the oppressive stillness. She reached the door to the lecture hall, the one she had passed so many times without giving it a second thought. Now she couldn't escape the compulsion to go inside. It was as though the institute itself was pulling her in, willing her to uncover the final pieces of its twisted puzzle. Ava opened the door. Inside, the lecture hall was empty, save for the faded remnants of what had once been a classroom. Dust-covered desks sat in neat rows, and the podium at the front was adorned with strange markings, symbols she had never noticed before. The chalkboard had been wiped clean, but the faint outlines of something scrawled there lingered, as though someone had tried to erase the words but failed. Her gaze shifted to the far side of the room, where a door stood ajar, half hidden in shadow. It led down a narrow hallway, one she hadn't noticed on her earlier explorations. Curiosity, or perhaps madness, propelled her forward. She stepped into the hall, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight, the air colder than before. As she walked further into the passage, the walls seemed to close in on her, the ceiling lowering, the hallway stretching longer than it had any right to. The atmosphere here was different. There was no longer the faint hum of electricity, the flicker of lights. Everything was dead silent. The only sound was the echo of her own breathing, sharp and ragged in her ears. She reached the end of the hallway and found herself in front of another door. This one was unlike any she had seen before. It was old, much older than anything else in the institute, with rusted iron hinges and a heavy brass handle. The door seemed almost too solid for a place that had been built only a few decades ago. She reached for the handle and was struck by the coldness that shot through her fingers. The moment she touched it, a wave of dizziness washed over her. Her vision blurred, and for an instant, it felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting, spinning. She blinked hard and shook her head, trying to clear the fog that had descended on her mind. When she opened her eyes again, the door had opened by itself, silently, as though inviting her in. Ava stepped through. On the other side was a room unlike any other she had encountered. It was smaller, more intimate, but every inch of it seemed wrong. The walls were lined with rows upon rows of old tomes, their spines covered in thick dust, their titles almost indecipherable. The air smelled damp, like the inside of a forgotten crypt. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering light hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Ava's breath caught in her throat as her eyes settled on a large wooden table at the center of the room. It was covered in piles of old manuscripts, strange papers, and other unidentifiable objects. Among the clutter was something that stood out, a book open in the middle of the table. Her heart skipped a beat. It was the book, the same one she had seen in the study beneath the archives. the same one that had drawn her in, that had whispered in the back of her mind. The book whose symbols she had seen in her dreams, the one that had made promises, dark and terrible, of knowledge that no mortal was meant to possess. Ava's mind screamed at her to turn and leave, to turn back, to forget about this place, this cursed building. But her body moved of its own accord, drawn to the table as if some invisible force were pushing her forward. As she reached for the book, the room seemed to close around her, the shadows stretching and deepening, swallowing up the light. She could feel the weight of the knowledge in that book, pressing against her, pulling her down. The whispers were back, soft at first, but growing louder, insistent. They had followed her here, into this room. "You have come too far." The voice was clear now, not a whisper, but a deep, resonant tone that seemed to echo inside her skull. It felt as though the walls themselves were speaking. The Institute itself was speaking. But where the voice had once been soft and inviting, it now held a note of warning, of finality. Ava hesitated for a moment, the hand that had been inching toward the pages stopping mid-air. She was afraid, truly afraid, for the first time since she had entered this cursed place, but it was too late. The pull was stronger than her fear, and with a trembling hand, she turned the first page. At once the room seemed to come alive. The shadows shifted violently, and a high-pitched, piercing screech filled her ears. The air crackled, like static electricity before a storm. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, and then, the whispers, they roared. A cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, demanding attention, their words impossible to distinguish from one another. Ava screamed, the sound swallowed by the chaos around her. The room twisted. The book pulsed in her hands. And then, as if the entire world had been thrown into reverse, everything went dark. Chapter 8 continued. The silence between the pages. Ava opened her eyes to find herself back in the lecture hall, the book still clutched tightly in her hands. But something was wrong. The air was too still, too thick, like the world itself had been sucked of its sound, leaving only the ringing echo of her heartbeat. She blinked, disoriented, her head spinning with the sudden shift in reality. The tremors that had racked her body only moments ago had ceased. Yet she could still feel the reverberations in her limbs, like the aftershocks of an earthquake that refused to let go. The book, however, had not remained the same. It now sat in her hands, as if untouched, yet changed. The symbols on its pages glowed faintly, an unnatural light pulsing in time with her heart. The pages were alive, each one curling, twisting in a way that no paper should. There was something grotesque about it, something too organic, too visceral, as if the book itself were breathing. She pulled her hands back quickly, repulsed, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from it. The whispers had returned, but they were no longer a soft hum at the edge of her hearing. Now, they were as clear as if someone were speaking directly into her ear. The words were unintelligible, their tone urgent, insistent. Yet despite their inhuman quality, Ava felt a strange pull, an unexplainable need to understand. For a moment, she simply stared at the book, as if trying to make sense of what was happening. Her thoughts, fragmented and broken, floated in and out of focus. She wasn't sure whether she had just hallucinated the events that had transpired before, the flickering light, the chaotic voices, or if they were somehow real. But deep down, a gnawing certainty had lodged itself in her mind. She was not alone here. She never had been. The room was still, too still, but as her eyes darted around, she saw something new. Shadows. The edges of the room, where the darkness was the thickest, were now crawling with them. The shadows moved in a way that didn't make sense, not like any ordinary shadow. They stretched and writhed, coiling in and out of the walls, pooling at the floor like ink spilling from an unseen source. Her breathing quickened. In the far corner of the room, a figure stood. It was cloaked in darkness, its form only partially visible, as though it were partially consumed by the very shadows it stood in. Ava's breath caught in her throat as she recognized it. The man from her dreams. The one with the hollow, staring eyes. The figure tilted its head, as though it could sense her gaze. and in that moment, the shadows around it seemed to stir with life. They began to writhe and twist more violently, like snakes drawn to a flame. The figure stepped forward, its movements deliberate and slow, every step a calculated descent into the heart of her fear. Ava couldn't move. Her body felt frozen, as though something was holding her in place, tethering her to the spot. The book in her hands began to vibrate once again, the symbols on the pages now changing, shifting from one form to another, ever evolving. She was no longer reading words, but witnessing something far more primal, more dangerous. A tapestry of symbols, each more ancient and incomprehensible than the last. The man's voice cut through the silence, low and guttural, like the rumble of thunder beneath the earth. You shouldn't have come here. Ava's heart skipped a beat, her pulse thunderous in her ears. What is this place? She managed to whisper, her voice barely audible, swallowed up by the oppressive atmosphere. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it simply stepped closer, emerging from the shadows like some cursed entity from a forgotten myth. The closer it came, the more the shadows seemed to follow it, closing in on the space around Ava. The room itself seemed to constrict, its boundaries tightening until she was standing in a suffocating pocket of air. This place, the figure finally spoke, its voice now dripping with dark amusement, is the beginning of the end. Ava's vision blurred, her surroundings shifting once again, as if the very fabric of reality were unraveling. She stumbled back, only to be met by the cold stone wall behind her, the chill biting into her skin. No, she gasped, her mind reeling. No, this can't be real. This is... But the figure was already upon her, its hollow eyes locked onto hers, as though it could see into the very depths of her soul. Everything you've learned, it continued, its tone a mocking whisper. Everything you thought you understood, it's all connected. This institute is just a shell, a facade. There is something beneath it, something far older, and you have opened the door to it. Ava's head swam. Her knees buckled beneath her, the weight of the truth crashing down on her like a tidal wave. The institute was not what it seemed. There were things beneath the surface, things buried so deeply that no one was supposed to find them. But she had found them. The shadows pressed in closer, seeping into every corner of the room, crawling up her legs, over her arms. They whispered in her ears, their voices an incoherent blur, but she could feel their meaning. A promise, a curse. You have awakened it. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers elongated and twisted, its skin pale and mottled. It was so close now that Ava could feel the cold emanating from it, a bone-deep chill that made her teeth chatter. The shadows wrapped themselves around her, binding her in place, constricting her chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. And then, just as she thought she would suffocate under the weight of the darkness, she heard a voice, a real voice, her own. No, Ava whispered to herself, her eyes wide with panic. No, no, no! The figure raised its hand as if to silence her, but it was too late. The world around her exploded into light, blinding and overwhelming. The book in her hands flared with a sudden, violent energy, its pages spinning as if caught in a whirlwind. The shadows writhed violently, screeching, tearing themselves apart as if in agony. Then, everything went black. Chapter 9. The descent into the dark Ava's world had crumbled. The darkness had come for her, not in the form of night, but as something far more insidious. The shadowed figure, its hollow eyes staring through her very being, had made it clear. She had unlocked something she was never meant to understand. The air around her felt thick, as if the very atmosphere had become a liquid, pressing in on her, suffocating her thoughts. Her pulse raced, erratic, and the low hum of dread curled deep in her gut. But she was no longer in control of her body. It was as if some invisible force had taken hold, dragging her forward. She had been standing, trapped in the oppressive atmosphere of the lecture hall. But now, her surroundings had shifted again. This time, there was no lecture hall, no institute, no sense of order. Everything was dark. Ava was lying on her back, surrounded by a dense, inky blackness that made the night feel like a dim memory. Her body felt heavy, bound to the earth in a way that felt unnatural. like her limbs were caught in the very fabric of the world's decay. She tried to sit up, but the darkness seemed to pulse around her, as though it were breathing, constricting with each breath she took. The air itself was thick, and every movement she made felt like it was costing her something. Her energy, her sanity, maybe even her very soul. Her breath hitched. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. It was as if her voice had been swallowed whole by the abyss. She couldn't even find the strength to move, her body sluggish, drained of vitality. The shadows pressed closer, closing in around her like an inevitable fate. Her mind swirled, grasping for any sense of logic, any shred of understanding. Where was she? How had she ended up here? Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, its form barely visible through the black void. Ava's heart leapt. She couldn't make out the details of its shape, but it was moving toward her, and she instinctively felt that it was not a friend. It was coming for her. With a Herculean effort, she managed to push herself up, though her limbs felt as if they were dragging chains behind them. She forced herself to take a step, then another, but her legs were weak, trembling beneath her. "Who's there?" she whispered into the void, though the words came out more as a croak, the sound lost to the emptiness. The figure didn't answer. It simply kept coming, its shape becoming clearer, the outlines of its features slowly emerging from the shadows. And then she saw it, the eyes, those same hollow black eyes. Her stomach dropped. A wave of nausea hit her, and she stumbled backward, falling to the cold ground. The figure stood over her now, impossibly close, towering above her as its presence swallowed her whole. The shadows seemed to writhe around it like living creatures, feeding on the darkness that hung heavy in the air. Ava gasped. The figure bent down, its voice as low and raspy as a whisper through a rusted pipe. "You've come too far." Ava tried to speak, but no words formed. Her throat was dry, raw, as if the very act of trying to communicate had become a futile gesture. She stared up at the figure, feeling her mind slipping, as though her very identity were starting to fray at the edges. You are not the first," the figure continued. Its voice had no emotion, no warmth, only the hollow echo of something that had long been lost. "But you are the one who will end it." The words sent a shiver through Ava's spine. End it? What was it? What was this place? Why couldn't she remember? The confusion, the fear, it all mixed together, swirling like a storm inside her mind. The words felt like a riddle, an answer without a question. And then, without warning, the figure reached down and touched her forehead. It was cold, excruciatingly cold. Ava screamed, but it was no use. The shadows swallowed her voice, just as they had swallowed everything else. Images began to flood her mind. Memories she couldn't place. Faces she had never seen. It was as if the very fabric of her life was being unraveled, piece by piece, and replaced with something else, something ancient and incomprehensible. She was in a room. A sterile metallic room. There were no windows, no doors. But she wasn't alone. There were others there, sitting in rows, their faces covered with a strange black cloth. Each one seemed to be staring forward, but their eyes were empty. Ava felt a surge of panic. Why was she there? Why was she seeing this? The memories blurred into more fragments. Flashes of a cold, grey hallway, a door locked behind her, the sound of whispers, the hiss of machines. The memories faded. Ava's head spun, a torrent of strange symbols, noises and voices filling her ears. Too many for her to process, each one more jarring than the last. They were overwhelming, pushing against the very edges of her sanity. Her vision began to flicker in and out of focus. "You were part of it," the figure's voice returned, growing colder with each word. "You were meant to be." Ava's breath quickened as she struggled to focus on the figure before her, but its form was shifting now, melting into the shadows. The temperature dropped, and she felt her skin prickle with an unnatural chill. The ground beneath her began to ripple like water disturbed by a sudden wind. The air grew denser, the weight of it pressing on her chest, making it harder to breathe. "No!" Ava tried to speak, but the words seemed to die in her throat. The The figure continued to fade in and out, its shape becoming more fluid, more unnatural by the second. You were always supposed to be here. The last thing Ava saw before her mind shattered into darkness was the shape of the figure. No longer a man, but something far worse. Something not quite human. Ava awoke in a cold sweat, her heart hammering in her chest. Her body trembled violently, the terror of her dream still gripping her with icy fingers. She gasped for air, as if emerging from the depths of a suffocating sea. The room around her was dimly lit, the faint glow of a dying light bulb casting long shadows across the floor. She sat up slowly, her head spinning. It was just a dream, she told herself. Just a dream. But it didn't feel like a dream. It felt too real. The cold dread from the dream still clung to her skin, and she felt an unshakable sense of wrongness in the air. She reached for the bedside lamp, flicking the switch, only for the bulb to buzz and die in a flicker of electrical static. The room plunged into darkness. Ava's breath caught in her throat. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, writhing like living things. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she heard the faint sound of breathing. Inhuman breathing. Behind her. "You can never escape," a voice whispered from the darkness. Ava's blood ran cold. She had never left the nightmare. Chapter 9. The descent into the dark continued. Ava's breath quickened, each inhalation feeling sharper than the last as the dark room pressed in around her, its suffocating weight impossible to escape. The whisper from the shadows had sent a shiver down her spine, the voice so close that it felt as if it were coming from inside her head. Her heart pounded violently in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears like a distant drum. For a moment there was silence, no movement, no sounds, save for the unnatural hiss of the air around her. Ava strained to listen, her eyes wide, darting from corner to corner, but the room remained still. The shadows, however, felt alive, crawling, swirling, as though they were more than mere absence of light. It was in here with her. The thought gripped her with icy fingers, causing her skin to crawl. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Slowly she turned, her eyes scanning the darkness, looking for any sign of movement. Her breath caught when she noticed something. A shape in the far corner of the room, just outside the faint light. A figure. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her, a figment of her fear. But no, it was real. The figure loomed in the corner, a dark silhouette against the inky backdrop. It was tall, thin, with long, elongated limbs that appeared unnatural, too long to be human. And the most striking thing of all was its face, or rather, the absence of one. It had no eyes, no mouth, just an empty, hollow face, pale and lifeless, like a mannequin left too long in the dark. Ava froze. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee, but her legs refused to obey, as if they were bound by invisible chains. The figure stirred. Slowly, it began to move toward her, its limbs swaying like branches in the wind. No sound accompanied its movements, no footfalls, no breath. Just the oppressive, suffocating silence that hung heavy in the air. The room seemed to grow colder with each step it took. Ava's teeth chattered, her fingers trembling as they gripped the edge of the bed for support. But she could not tear her eyes away from the figure. It was moving too quickly now, and she could feel the weight of its presence, the dark energy it carried with it. When it was mere inches from her, it stopped. Its shape loomed over her, towering in the small, dim room. Ava's breath hitched in her throat as the emptiness of its face seemed to draw her in, like a void she could not escape. And then, it spoke. "No matter how far you run, you will never escape what you have awakened." Ava's voice failed her. Her throat was dry, her chest constricted with fear. She tried to speak, to ask it what it wanted, but the words wouldn't come. "You've seen it, haven't you?" the figure continued, its voice rasping like the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. "You've seen the truth. This place, it is not what it seems. It is not what you think." The figure leaned in closer, its presence overwhelming. Ava could feel the cold emanating from it, the unnatural chill sinking into her bones. She could see her breath forming in front of her, the air around her growing icy as the darkness thickened. The Institute, the figure whispered, was never meant to help. It was meant to break. Ava recoiled. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, leaving her breathless. What did it mean? What had she uncovered? She had only come here seeking answers, but now it felt as if the answers were closing in on her, swallowing her whole. The figure took another step closer, its long fingers reaching out toward her. The cold intensified. Ava's skin prickled as the shadowed hand hovered near her face, and she instinctively pulled away, her heart racing. "You know!" the figure hissed, its breath foul and sharp. "You are not the first to come here. You are not the first to seek the truth." Suddenly, Ava felt a sharp pain in her chest. It was as if something had pierced her heart. A coldness that spread through her body, making her limbs feel numb. She gasped, her hand instinctively clutching at her chest as she struggled to breathe. What have you done?" she croaked, her voice cracking, the figure's empty gaze fixed on her. And for a moment, she could have sworn that something flickered within its hollow eyes. Something malicious, something that reveled in her pain. "It has already begun," it whispered. "The end." Ava's vision blurred. Her surroundings distorted, bending and twisting as if they were warping into another reality. The shadows, which had once been mere dark corners, now seemed to take form, shifting into grotesque shapes that loomed and crawled around her. They stretched across the walls, writhing like living creatures. She stumbled back, her legs buckling beneath her. Her mind screamed for her to wake up, to escape, but the shadows closed in on her, wrapping around her like a noose, suffocating her thoughts. A chill ran through her. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't some nightmare. It was real. In the chaos, she remembered the book, the cursed book, its pages covered with incomprehensible symbols and messages from the shadows. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, still lying discarded on the floor beside the bed. She clutched it to her chest, hoping that it would provide some sort of answer, some way to break free from the nightmarish grip of the dark. The figure watched her, its faceless gaze never leaving her. Ava opened the book, her fingers skimming across the pages, desperately searching for something, anything, that could offer her a way out. She paused, staring at a page that seemed to shimmer, its symbols glowing faintly under her touch. As her fingers brushed the words, the symbols began to shift, rearranging themselves in ways that were both familiar and terrifying. "The truth is hidden within the dark," she read aloud, her voice hoarse. The words felt as if they were burned into her mind. "The veil has been lifted, and you have seen it. You are the key to ending this." The figure moved again, its hands reaching toward her. Ava could feel the cold wrapping around her heart, crushing the air from her lungs. But something inside her stirred. The words from the book, the truth that it held. It wasn't just a warning. It was a call to action. Ava slammed the book shut with a force that sent a jolt through her body. The figure recoiled, its form flickering in and out of existence. The shadows seemed to hesitate, as if confused by her defiance. But Ava wasn't done, not yet. The cold, the darkness, it was not going to take her, not without a fight. Ava rose, shaky but determined. She stepped toward the figure, the book still clutched tightly in her hand. The shadows shrank away from her, recoiling in terror. She was done being afraid. "You don't control me," she whispered, her voice steady and filled with newfound strength. "I control my fate." And as she spoke, something in the air shifted. The figure wavered, its form becoming less solid, its movements more erratic. The shadows seemed to hiss in frustration as they retreated, unable to reach her. Ava knew this was only the beginning. The truth was out there, buried deep within the Institute, and she was going to find it. But she had to survive this night. The shadows would no longer be her prison. They would be her power. Chapter 10. The descent deepens. Ava's world had begun to fragment. Each passing hour twisted the fabric of reality, bending it in ways that could not be explained by logic, nor by anything she had learned in her years of study. The Pursuit Institute had never felt more alien, more malignant. It was no longer simply a place, an institution of supposed knowledge and academic prowess. It was a prison, a labyrinth of horrors with no escape, and she was its latest prisoner. The dark corridors seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the walls closing in with each step she took. The shadows that flickered at the edges of her vision were no longer the trick of an overactive imagination. No, they were real, alive, whispering, reaching for her, as if they had been waiting for her all along. The deeper she ventured into the institute, the thicker the air grew, as though something unseen and malevolent was pulling at the very essence of the building itself, bending it to its will. Ava pressed her hand against the cold stone wall, her fingertips trembling as the chill sank into her skin, like a living thing. Her mind, once sharp and clear, now felt like a fragile thing, a cracking vessel held together by sheer force of will. The whispers, always faint at first, had begun to grow louder. She heard them even when there was no one around to speak. They slithered into her thoughts when she wasn't looking, creeping in like tendrils of doubt, poisoning her every rational thought. The institute had never felt more oppressive. The very air felt thick, heavy, as though it weighed on her chest, making each breath a struggle. Ava didn't know how long she had been wandering. Hours? Days? Time had lost its meaning. She hadn't seen another living soul since she had ventured deeper into the institute's bowels. It was as though she were the last living person in this forsaken place. A cold shiver ran down her spine. The whispers had stopped. Where are they? The absence of sound was far more terrifying than any noise. Ava's heart raced as her breath quickened, a sense of dread pooling deep in her gut. She glanced over her shoulder, but the hallway was empty. Still. Too still. 1,000 possible dangers lurked just out of sight. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if they too were alive, watching her. Her eyes darted to the door at the far end of the hallway. It was old, rusted hinges and peeling paint, but there was something about it, something that called to her, as if it had been waiting for her to open it all along. She moved toward it, the sound of her footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence. When her fingers brushed against the cold metal of the door's handle, a sharp jolt of pain shot through her hand. She pulled back, gasping as though something had pierced her skin. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked down at her hand, expecting to see blood, but there was nothing. The pain, though, lingered. It lingered in her mind, in her chest. Something was wrong. Ava's eyes flicked back to the door. The air around it had shifted. The shadows that had been stalking her now gathered around the entrance, swirling like a living fog, their tendrils curling beneath the door. A voice, low and garbled, floated toward her, muffled and distant, as though spoken from deep underwater. Ava. She flinched at the sound of her name. She could hear the whispers again, only they weren't whispers anymore. They were calls, voices in the darkness that beckoned her forward. She reached for the door again, her hand trembling. This time, the metal handle felt colder, like ice had settled beneath it. She gripped it tightly and twisted, a slow creak of rusted iron filling the air. The door opened with a groan, revealing the room beyond. It was darker inside than she could have imagined. The room was vast, stretching farther than she could see, but there was something else, something familiar. Her breath hitched. There, in the center of the room, stood a large mirror. It was framed in dark wood, its surface smooth and perfectly still, like a pond untouched by wind. Ava stepped into the room, drawn to the mirror despite herself. Her reflection met her in the glass, but it was wrong. The face that stared back at her was distorted. Her eyes were wide, panic-stricken, and yet the reflection remained eerily calm. It smiled at her. Ava recoiled, stepping back. The smile in the mirror stretched wider, impossibly wide. It was no longer her face, no longer her body. She saw the reflection of someone else, a figure that was not hers at all. And then the voice again. It came from the mirror this time, clear and chilling. "You don't belong here, Ava," it whispered. "You've awakened what should have remained asleep." Her heart stuttered in her chest, her breath becoming shallow. "What are you?" she demanded, her voice cracking as she stepped forward, trying to reach the mirror, trying to grasp the truth that eluded her. "You know who I am." The voice was unmistakable now. The same voice she had heard echoing in her head, in the walls, in the shadows. The one that had haunted her since she arrived. But it wasn't just the voice. The reflection in the mirror was changing, shifting into something else, something terrible. The figure grinned wider. Its eyes, hollow and black, bore into hers with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, like broken glass. The reflection moved, stepping out of the mirror, as though it had crossed some boundary. Ava stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet, but she couldn't look away. She was caught, trapped in its gaze. It reached for her, its arms long and unnaturally thin, its fingers extending like claws. "No," Ava gasped, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't come here for this." The figure's smile widened, its mouth stretching impossibly far. "You came here for the truth," it rasped, "but the truth has no place in this world." Before she could move, it was upon her. The coldness that radiated from the creature sank into her skin, spreading like ice through her veins. She felt herself freeze, unable to move, unable to scream. And then, the darkness swallowed her. Chapter 10. The descent deepens, continued. Ava's mind was a blur, fragments of reality slipping through her grasp like sand through clenched fingers. The sensation of cold gripped her body, sharp and unyielding, suffocating her in its chill. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her throat was tight, constricted, as if something invisible was pressing down on her chest, forcing the air out of her lungs. Her vision swam as the figure from the mirror loomed closer. Its twisted smile, its mouth far too wide, stretched further until it seemed as though it might split its face in half. But it wasn't the smile that caught her attention. It was the eyes. The darkness in them, blacker than the deepest abyss, seemed to reach into her very soul, pulling at the threads of her sanity. Every time she tried to look away, the eyes would follow, locking her in place, trapping her in their suffocating gaze. "Do you see it now?" the voice whispered, not from the figure's mouth, but from everywhere, around her, inside her, filling her mind. The truth that was never meant to be known. Ava stumbled backward, her legs shaking beneath her, but her feet would not move. The room around her seemed to warp and twist, the walls stretching as if they had a life of their own. The once still shadows now writhed, slithering across the floor like serpents, their forms changing with each blink of her eyes. The room, the institute, everything was alive, and it was waiting for her to break. "You can't escape," the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. "There is no way out. You are already part of this place. You always have been." Ava felt her heart hammer in her chest, the pounding beat drowning out the whispers, but even that couldn't mask the overwhelming feeling of dread that seeped into her bones. Part of this place. She didn't understand. She couldn't understand. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring her terror. Its long, spindly fingers reached out, and Ava could do nothing but watch as they hovered just inches from her face. She was frozen, trapped in a paralyzing nightmare, her body refusing to obey her commands. The fingers brushed her cheek, cold and clammy, like the touch of death itself. The room seemed to contract even further, suffocating her, until the walls pressed in like the jaws of some monstrous beast. The creature before her tilted its head, studying her with a mocking curiosity, as if it could see into her very soul. "You don't remember, do you?" it crooned, its voice now sickeningly sweet. "You think you're different, but you're just like the others. All of you. You came here to learn the truth, and now you're paying the price for it." Ava's mind was reeling, the weight of the words crashing down on her. The others? She didn't understand. She couldn't understand, but a flicker of something, a memory perhaps, pushed its way to the surface. She thought of the other students, the ones she had seen in the halls before, the ones who had disappeared. Had they all been here for the same reason? Had they too sought answers, only to be consumed by the very thing they sought? The figure laughed, a sound that echoed through the room like the clinking of chains. "You were never meant to leave. None of you were. The Pursuit Institute was never about knowledge, Ava. It was about control. It was about keeping the truth buried deep enough that no one would ever dare uncover it. But you did, didn't you? Her mind flickered, the edges of her vision blurring. I didn't mean to, she whispered, her voice trembling. I only wanted to learn. The figure's smile widened even further, its face stretching impossibly wide. It leaned in close, its breath a cold, rancid whisper against her ear. The truth is a lie, Ava. The truth is what binds you to this place. And now, you will be its next victim. Before she could react, the world around her seemed to collapse. The walls buckled inwards, the shadows swallowing everything whole. The floor beneath her feet cracked, splitting apart like a ravine opening wide, threatening to swallow her whole. Ava's body lurched forward as if the floor had been ripped from beneath her, and she felt herself falling through an endless void, into darkness. Her stomach churned, her breath catching in her throat as the descent seemed to stretch on forever. Time became irrelevant, her sense of self slipping away as the cold darkness surrounded her, wrapping her in its embrace. She reached out, grasping at anything to hold on to. But there was nothing but the emptiness. Suddenly, her body jerked to a halt. The ground beneath her feet solidified, and she was thrown forward, landing on cold, damp stone. She gasped, sucking in a breath of air, as the world around her slowly came into focus. She was no longer in the institute. She was somewhere else, somewhere far worse. The air was thick with a metallic scent, sharp and sour. The walls around her were stone, dark and jagged, with strange symbols carved into their surface. Symbols that seemed to shift and twist when she looked away, like living things that writhed in the corners of her vision. "Welcome," the voice said again, this time not from the figure, but from everywhere. "Welcome to the heart of the Institute. Welcome to the place where all truths are born, and where they die." Ava slowly stood, her legs shaking as the realization hit her. She was no longer in the Institute's familiar halls. She was in the place beneath it, the place it had all been leading to, the heart of its madness. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw them. Others. Figures in the distance, standing like statues, their forms frozen in place. Their faces were obscured, hidden by shadows, but their presence was unmistakable. They were the lost students, the ones who had disappeared, just as the voice had said. Ava took a step forward, her heart racing. She had to know. She had to find the answers. She had come this far. She couldn't stop now. But as she took another step, a chilling thought pierced her mind. What if the truth was worse than the lie? The figure's voice cut through her thoughts, its tone mocking, as if it had been reading her mind. "You want answers, don't you? You want to know what happened to all of them. What happened to you?" Ava's blood ran cold. The air grew heavier, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, and the figures began to move, slowly, deliberately. Their faces, those faces she couldn't quite see, began to shift, becoming clearer, more distinct. And as their features became visible, Ava felt her stomach churn violently. They were not human. They were something else, something twisted. Their faces were contorted into grotesque masks of pain, their eyes empty voids that seemed to stare into her very soul. Their mouths were wide, too wide, their teeth jagged, their skin pale and stretched over the bones of something ancient. Ava's breath caught in her throat, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed, trapped in the gaze of these things. Their silent, eerie movements were the only sound in the room, and they were closing in on her, step by deliberate step. Ava tried to scream, but no sound came. The walls seemed to pulse, and the floor beneath her feet began to tremble as if the very foundations of this place were alive, waking from a deep slumber. The air vibrated with a low humming noise, growing louder and louder, until it reached a deafening crescendo. And then, the ground shattered. The final revelation. A convergence of madness. Ava stood in the center of the abyss, her body trembling, her mind unmoored from the world she had once known. The walls of the Institute, if it could still be called that, pressed in from all sides, its stones slick with an unnatural, clammy moisture. The shifting shadows that crawled along the floor and clung to the corners seemed to breathe, pulsating with a life of their own. The darkness was no longer just a physical presence. It had become an entity, an eternal hunger gnawing at her sanity. The figures surrounding her, the former students, the ones whose bodies were twisted into macabre forms, were now fully revealed. Their faces, once human, had long since been lost to some horrific transformation. Hollow, sunken eyes stared at her with vacant, soulless expressions. Their mouths were frozen in grotesque grimaces, twisted by some ancient curse that had bound them to this wretched place. They were not alive, but neither were they dead. They were something in between, caught in a purgatory of their own making. She had been warned, hadn't she? The truth, it seemed, was not a revelation, but a descent into something far worse than ignorance. The whispers, the distorted images in the mirrors, the voices. These had been the signs, the warnings she had ignored in her relentless pursuit of answers. And now, here she was, standing on the precipice of an unfathomable void, staring into the eyes of the damned. The voice that had guided her, the voice that had led her to this hellish underworld, was still with her. But now it wasn't just speaking to her, it was inside her. She could feel it slithering beneath her skin, filling her mind with thoughts that were not her own. It was no longer a separate entity. It had merged with her. There was no escape. There was no turning back. "You have learned," the voice whispered, thick with malice. "You have seen the truth, but now you belong to it, just as they did, just as I did." Ava closed her eyes, her pulse quickening as the weight of the revelation settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She had come seeking knowledge, seeking answers to the mysteries that had haunted her, but the truth had never been about enlightenment. It was a curse, an insidious force that devoured those who dared to look too closely. The Pursuit Institute was not a place of learning. It was a trap, a breeding ground for madness, and she had fallen right into its grasp. But what had she truly learned? That the Institute was not merely a building, not just a school. It was a living entity, an ancient, malignant force that fed on the minds of those who sought its forbidden truths. Its walls were not made of stone, but of the very souls it had consumed, and it was endless, always stretching, always growing. It was a prison that had no beginning and no end, and now it had claimed her. As she stood there, surrounded by the remnants of the lost, Ava understood the horrific truth. There was no escape from the Pursuit Institute. It was not a place in space, but a place in time, an unending loop, an eternal recurrence. The moment you set foot in its halls, you became part of its twisted fabric, a piece of its unholy design. No one had ever truly escaped, and no one ever would. The other students, the ones who had vanished, Ava could now see it clearly, had been consumed by the Institute long before her. Their fates had been sealed the moment they walked through its doors. Their bodies had been reshaped, remade into something unrecognizable, but their souls remained, trapped in the labyrinthine corridors of the Institute, their minds forever fractured. And now it was her turn. Ava's body twitched, a wave of cold coursing through her veins. She could feel her form shifting, her mind unraveling. Her very sense of self was beginning to fracture, breaking apart like the pieces of a shattered mirror. She could hear the whispers again, louder now, and they were hers. Her thoughts, her desires, her fears, they all belonged to the Institute now. As her vision blurred and the shadows seemed to close in around her, Ava realized, with a chilling finality, that she was no longer the one seeking answers. She was the answer. She was the culmination of everything the Institute had been waiting for, a new part of its eternal, ever-expanding body. Ava had always believed that truth was a path to freedom. She had been wrong. The truth was a chain, a shackle, and now it had bound her tightly to this place, to its never-ending hunger. The last thing Ava saw before everything faded into the oppressive blackness was the twisted faces of the lost students, their eyes hollow, but somehow pleading. They weren't asking for help. They were warning her. And then, as everything dissolved into nothingness, the whispers grew silent. There was no sound, no breath, no thought, only the crushing weight of eternal darkness. Epilogue. Somewhere, in a place outside of time, the Pursuit Institute waited, its walls ever growing, ever hungry. And somewhere, deep within its labyrinthine heart, Ava's presence lingered, her soul, like the others, a permanent fixture in the never-ending nightmare that had once been a school. The truth, the terrible, terrible truth, was that no one ever left. And the Institute, it would never stop pursuing. End of the story. Analysis. The conclusion ties together the central themes of the narrative: the futility of seeking knowledge in the face of unanswerable horrors, and the endless cycle of damnation that the Pursuit Institute imposes on its victims. Ava's tragic fate is sealed not just by the Institute's physical and mental torture, but by the very truth she sought. In the end, she becomes one with the Institute, joining the other lost souls in an eternal cycle of torment, with no hope of escape or redemption. The story closes on a chilling note, suggesting that the cycle will continue, that others may come seeking answers, only to fall into the same trap. The Institute's hunger for knowledge, and for souls, is insatiable, and those who enter never truly leave.